I'm going to make the introduction super quick since we had some delay for technical issues. So I'm very delighted to introduce our speaker today, a colleague of mine in the philosophy department, Chad Kautzer. He's beloved to his students, beloved to faculty, especially beloved to the Jefferson County School Board. When he's not calling on the resignation of elected officials in Colorado, he actually writes a lot in philosophy. He has a book coming out very soon called Radical Philosophy: An Introduction from Paradigm Publishers. Today he is speaking on this, homelessness, security, and the politics of disappearance. So please join me in welcoming Chad Kautzer.
Thank you. Give me 1 second. I'm trying to. It's good. I'm trying to figure out how to not sit behind the. Let me just. Okay, that's working. Okay, first of all, thank you very much for coming out. This is really exciting. I'm sorry that we changed rooms. I'm sorry that we had a delay. I know many of you, so you know that I've been thinking about these issues for a long time. And I'm coming at this from the perspective of critical theory. So I take a kind of unique approach to social theory and philosophical theory. So I just want to talk a little bit about that first, so you understand the approach that I'm taking, and then I'll start working through some of the ideas. This is not a finished paper. I am hoping to get ideas from you, responses from you, feedback. I want to develop these, see if do they resonate or not. I know a lot of folks in this room are organizers and activists around this issue, and so I really want to hear from people. How much time do we have, by the way, for the event?
Until 5.
Until 5. Okay. Okay. So first, starting with this word that's probably new for a lot of folks, which is disappearance with a Y. This is a concept that comes out of disability studies, and the idea is that bodies are made to appear through disabling built environments and social norms. So they, in a sense, become present to us, are, in a sense, unfit in their environment because of the way the environment is built, and that was a product of human activity and informed by certain norms. So if you, from disability studies, you could imagine, for example, a wheelchair, someone in a wheelchair sitting before a tall set of steps, right? Just because someone lacks some form of mobility or their body is impaired some way in terms of mobility doesn't mean the same thing as that they shouldn't be able to get around the way other folks can. So there's a difference between one's bodily impairment and the social environment that we construct to facilitate social relations, political relations, economic relations, and so forth. And so I thought this was a good concept to use in the context of homelessness, because I think we're dealing with the same kind of dynamic, right? Okay. Now, on to that idea of critical social theory. So for me, when I'm thinking about these things, I always want to look at what's actually happening. What are people actually doing? What are the social relations involved? And this is the social relations and social practices are really important to think about, because often you see a lot of theory that's produced that abstracts the individual from their social relations. So it's just the individual, for example, in the concept of disappearance. If you look just at the individual, you would just see bodily impairments or bodily differences. You wouldn't see the social construction of environments that are disabling to those people, right? And who built those and why, and what are the norms that inform them. So you have to broaden out and in my opinion, we need to broaden out and look at people in their relations and concrete social practices to produce good theory. Also, interdisciplinary. So although I'm trained as a philosopher, I use legal theory, sociological theory, economics, and try to bring them together to understand some particular social phenomenon. And I think that's, again, just like separating the individual. If you just take one disciplinary perspective, then it's impoverished, right? Because once you add in all, it's like taking just our race identity or our gendered identity or our class identity without the others. We get a one-sided picture, right? And we start to attribute behaviors and practices to just one source rather than having this multivariable dynamic. The other is that critical social theory is normative. It seeks to actually inform social practices to transform the status quo, which by definition, because it's something that we theorize critically about, is something that we want to change. So there's some form of domination, some form of social injustice. And so the theory is meant to be in dialogue with social actors, many of you are here, to develop ways of thinking about our practices in trying to change the status quo. Right? And of course, in this context, the injustice is homelessness, which is systematic and structural. It's not, as I argue, which most of you I'm sure would agree with, it's not just subject to personal responsibility, personal individual actions. Okay, so that's the perspective that I'm coming from, and I'm so glad that so many of you came, because like I said, this is a dialogue, and so I'm developing the theory as I'm talking to people and participating in these practices as well. One other thing, there are kind of two different dimensions to this second part, this third point, which is that you, and this is why I think theory is so important, and this kind of theory in particular, is that you want to know, you want to have a good analysis of what to target in your social practices, right? So you want to know the source, the origins of the problem, but you also want to have a vision, an idea of how you would change things. What would be the next step? If you were going to abolish the status quo, what would you replace it with, right? And so that's the role of theory. Okay. Disappearing versus disappearing. So I talked about this, that your bodies are made to, in a sense, appear in disabling social environments. This second part is the next step here. So how we construct our built environments, systems of transportation, communication, employment, housing, and social institutions are informed by norms, both formal, like laws, and informal, such as ethical norms. Such environments and institutions render certain bodies and social practices unfit. Not somehow essentially or naturally, but we have produced collectively a set of institutions that render some people unfit to the social environment. And I'm gonna, in the talk today, I'm gonna develop these ideas of this formal and informal. So the formal is law. I'm gonna talk about public and private law and how those are policed using state powers as coercion. And informal, I'm going to talk both about kind of moral sympathies and traditional ways of thinking about advocating for homeless folks, and social recognition, which is a little bit more comprehensive and actually involves, implicates the privileged when we think about these things. Okay. The aesthetics of moral sympathy. One of the reasons, as I'll talk about in a minute, I curated this art exhibition called Not Exactly Between Home and Where I Find Myself. And that project and this paper is a response to what I see as a traditional way of thinking about homelessness, trying to advocate for the homeless, and trying to resolve or eliminate homelessness. And you get an aesthetics of, I think this is, I want to go there. You get an aesthetics of moral sympathy. So the idea is that you want to get folks who are housed, privileged, to sympathize with an individual's suffering, their individual pain, right? And so this idea, especially with children, as we'll see, this has to do with the idea of this personal responsibility paradigm, that we think that homelessness is a result of personal failures or decisions rather than something structural. The aesthetic dimension of this is to try to present homelessness in a way that elicits or evokes individual moral sympathy. Like, I feel bad for this particular girl, and I want to do something about it. I had a quote. I'm totally just disregarding my paper as I had it, so I'm just going to talk through this stuff. Let me just see where that quote is. I have this quote. Oh, yeah, here it is. So this is Greg Moore, editor-in-chief of the Denver Post, and he wrote an editorial about homelessness about 2 months ago. And he wrote, "Condemning adults for their choices is understandable. Consigning kids to a future without hope seems unacceptable." And so this is a very, very typical approach. Children are, in a sense, the most optimal subject for images about homelessness because there's no guilt involved. And we can't blame them for their condition. And most recently, there's a really strong campaign to house veterans. And that's the same logic. So veterans personally sacrifice. They deserve this. As individuals, they've done something to deserve this. I'm not saying they don't deserve it, but the point is, it's reduced to the individual's actions, right? Some people are deserving because of what they've chosen to do, and others are not deserving, right? So this is the kind of individualist moral paradigm, and this is the kind of aesthetics that go with it, right? And actually, if you have questions now, if I say something, just raise your hand and interrupt me, except for Janet. Just kidding, Janet.
Yeah, everything's good.
Okay, I want to say one other thing about this aesthetics, which is there's also around this a discourse about invisibility, the invisible homeless, the invisible poor, and therefore there are campaigns, and they're often named this, like make visible the homeless. I'm taking the opposite track. I'm saying that it's this disappearance, the visibility of the homeless that we have to look at, because there are groups who are fighting against that. It's a social relation. But anyway, so there's a discourse about invisibility, and we want to make the poor and homeless visible, and these are the kind of representations that we want to give to them in order to, if you're folks who have resources, in order to get you to donate money. Now, one effect of that is that you completely depoliticize homelessness as a structural, an effect of social relations and structural forces. It's somehow reduced to the individual. Second, you, in a sense, reinforce the position of the privileged by allowing them, one, to, in a sense, respond just by giving a little bit of money, but two, they actually feel, and this is, I mean, I'm speaking about myself, and this is the trend that I see, they actually feel better about their own position of privilege because at least they're not them, right? And this is how our identities are constructed. often in opposition to the conditions of others. So our sense of subjective welfare, how I'm doing, is judged in contradistinction to others' well-being. And so if others are suffering and I'm not, I feel good about my position. It, in a sense, reproduces the identity that I have in my social position. It strengthens it. Yeah.
I don't disagree with you, but I would use as a better example the pajama party that the rich have to raise money for the homeless. And I guess I think that you can have a personal, I think it's important to foreground individuals as well as address structural conditions, because sometimes the approaches that just target structural conditions, the people disappear. So I'm just, that's my concern.
Yeah, and that's a fantastic concern. And if I have time, I don't know how things are gonna shake out with time. But let me just say something briefly to that. So, which is, the alternative wouldn't be to try to represent structures. The alternative would be to empower folks to fight, to resist, to organize. And so, in a sense, instead of having pity and a handout, you have social organizations that are fighting. And so, this is one of the things I wanted to, just to kind of anticipate the last part of the talk, just in case we don't get to it, on social recognition, is when we stay with this model, like I said, we get this reinforced identity of the privileged. It doesn't challenge the privileged position. It doesn't problematize the social relations that give them privilege, that give me privilege, right? But the argument from the perspective of social recognition is that we, as privileged, as housed, as those that fit in the built environments and social norms that dominate our communities, that we have a deformed sense of moral autonomy, a sense of self. That we actually, when we attribute to others their failures based on their choices, we are ascribing to ourselves our successes based on our merit. And that's not true. That's just not true. You do not deserve your privilege because you're white, because you were born into a rich family, because you're male, because you're able-bodied. There are all these things, including chances that, and I'll talk about the market. It's not that people don't work hard and develop themselves and apply themselves, but your success is not all your own. It arises from these social structures that are beyond your control. And so when we attribute and create an aesthetics and campaigns and approaches that rely upon this individual moral responsibility, personal responsibility, etc., then we're, in a sense, ascribing that to ourselves. Our own success is attributable to our own personal responsibility. And this is a very individual, this is very common in political liberal thought, and it's very problematic because it's not true. I mean, when you move to sociology, you say, okay, well, it's not true. It's just not true. We know it's not true. But certain concepts and aesthetics reproduce that model. And that's what I'm trying to problematize. But I agree with Jana's point that it doesn't mean there can't be a combination or something. And of course, just showing people who are suffering is not in itself somehow bad. It's just when we're thinking from a perspective of critical theory, like how do we want to organize? What do we want to target? How do we want to speak about these things? Then I think we need to shift the ground toward something like social recognition, which I'll explain more. Good. Okay, let's see if I can. So, Christoph Wodiczko. Here's an alternative image. Arm the homeless. Is Jonathan here? I don't think so. Jonathan always carries the Arm the Homeless design. So Christoph Wodiczko is an artist, and he did this project in the 70s in New York about homeless folks in Tompkins Square. And he took all these photos of folks and then superimposed, like when they were sitting around eating at a table, he made it into like a military planning. And he would put guns in everyone's hands. And the idea is that this is a class issue, and it brings up the idea of class war, right? So just a different kind of aesthetic intervention into this. I just wanted to show a few images just because I love them. You can make them fit into the talk. This is from Laura Schill from the Not Exactly exhibition. And here is one of the things that I stipulated to the artists in the exhibition is that they do not do this aesthetics of moral pity. Do not represent folks as helpless or etc. And the only kind of representations of actual homeless folks should be presentation by themselves. They should be able to, so there are video interviews or homeless artists themselves producing their work about themselves. And this is something that Laura did, and I think this is nice about the disappearance, about trying to negotiate public spaces that are closed off from use. And so she did this series of not quite disappearing homelessness. Don't know what comes next. Okay. So let me just say a couple things about this. When I was thinking about this talk and this issue, I thought that this idea of disappearance is a nice way to start because it shows, in a sense, the fault line between private and public spaces. And private and public spaces are not set in stone. There's nothing solid or stable about them. They are the process of social struggles and contestation, and also certain logics that are at work. And I thought it would be, I think it's productive to talk about it in terms of security, different logics of security that produce a division between the public and the private. And I've identified three here that I think are really fundamental to understanding public and private spaces. The first is laws of public and private property. And that's security as protection of private property and public safety, or I should say public safety. Often, in the name of public safety, we get the promotion of certain kinds of public spaces, norms in those spaces, that are just to promote the property values of private property, or to, in a sense, clear zones for consumption for private businesses, right? And this is the urban camping ban in downtown Denver. The second, and this is probably the most abstract, but perhaps the most impactful. It's not the one that you feel, in a sense, you don't get it with the police. Confronting, that's the real physical, phenomenological experience of coercion. But with private capital, the securitization of debt, unregulated trade of mortgage-backed derivatives. This is security as the externalization of private investment risk. So, the short story is that in 1999, we had banking deregulation and the merging of commercial and investment banks. With that came an explosion in the production of what are called debt commodities, and most importantly, mortgage-backed debt commodities. So investment banks would buy the mortgages from commercial banks, your local bank that you got your mortgage from. They would securitize it, so they would mix it with other kinds of debt, and then they would cut it up into little pieces, little commodities, and then it gets circulated on an unregulated market. And this unregulated market was the source of the financial crash and created over 10 million foreclosures, well over 10 million foreclosures, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of homeless folks because of this. And it's not just the crash, it's the complete destabilization of the housing and rental markets. This has not changed. So there's been no reform or regulation of the derivative market, which is basically the trading of pieces of mortgage-backed securities. And not only that, there has been the development in the rental market of this. So now rents are tied into debt commodities and broken into pieces and sold and speculated on, destabilizing rental markets. Also making private banks buy up large amounts of the foreclosed homes and then creating a rise in rental rates in communities, which then prices people out and they end up on the streets. So,
Right.
yeah.
To put this into perspective, in 2009 dollars, there were $550 trillion of unregulated derivative market. That market by 2012, I've just looked it up, and it's grown to $710 trillion. Measurable goods and services are running about 70 trillion. That's tenfold out of whack.
Yeah, exactly. And this is
It's very dangerous.
This is not a minor
No.
issue, and it's fundamentally changed the housing and rental markets. Now, why is it about security? It's about security because we're talking about, the first one is talking about private and public property. The second one is talking about private capital. Capital is what you invest. It's property that's invested, wealth that's invested in the market in some form of production or rental or interest-bearing investments. So securitization is a way of shifting the risks associated with private capital to the public. The crisis is the risk that was shifted, because it wasn't the banks that went under, it was the people who lost their homes.
Right.
Banks got bailed out,
We got sold
they
out.
got sold out.
Right.
That's where that comes from, right? That's that shift. The banks and the we is the private and the public. So securitization is a way of shifting risk to the public. It makes the entire market systemically higher risk, creates more instability. And because it's directly associated with housing, housing is the first to be affected, right? And so the greatest economic crisis since the Great Depression has everything to do with housing insecurity. And this process of securitization and the merging of commercial and investment banks that happened only in 1999.
Just a quick question. Since AEG was the foremost firm insuring these securities, and with the explosion he mentioned, who's insuring these securities now? Is anybody?
We are.
Federal Reserve?
No.
No, it's
No.
it's completely unregulated.
Yeah, it's unregulated. So part of what it means to be unregulated is that there's no limitations on the ratio between capital reserves, what you actually have in capital, wealth, and what you're leveraging in terms of lending out, investing. So when the crash happened, a lot of banks that were investing in these derivatives were leveraging 30 to 1. So when the crash comes, that's 29 parts that don't get repaid. AIG was one of the largest insurers of those banks, but then it immediately went bankrupt because you can't insure all of these things. And so US taxpayer money went to bail out AIG, and then that money went dollar for dollar, and that money was sent to the banks to pay them for their losses.
Nice.
Nice.
Sweet deal.
Yeah. Very sweet.
There's another additional problem too, that I think you're driving towards. And that's when these are commoditized. They're commoditized without you as the homeowner. So you've signed the title. You have signed with the bank. And the bank, without your knowledge, has taken what you are legally responsible for and sold it in these commodity trade swaps, which is why there are at least a couple sheriff's departments in the United States that will not enforce the foreclosure orders, and they've had to go to a federal level, which really stinks.
Right, so.
Because technically the bank, the people in the derivatives market don't own your house. You do. You're legally responsible for it. It's a gray area that needs to be litigated.
Right, so what you buy when you invest in these derivatives is you get part of a revenue stream. That revenue stream traces back to you as a homeowner. As you're paying your mortgage, it's supposed to be then split up and end up in the hands of those who own this little bit of debt and a commodity. The process that you're talking about is probably the most important shift from the private to public risk, which is with the merger of commercial and investment banks, there is no longer an incentive on the part of your local bank to make sure that you are financially stable and can pay things back. Because what they'll do is they will give you a mortgage and then they will sell it for a fee immediately to a commercial bank that will break it up. And these are very sought after commodities of the market. And so the local bank, which would normally be, for better or worse, that force of checking the stability, financial stability of those getting loans and mortgages is taken out of the picture. And what we saw, this idea of reverse redlining, is that it used to be the case that redlining was drawing literally a line around parts, around neighborhoods and not giving them loans. This was often from white supremacy. It was basically denying certain communities access to capital in order to support, for racial reasons, right? Reverse redlining is that once you tapped out the market of those who need mortgages and could actually afford to pay them back, investment banks are demanding more to keep selling, creating these commodities out. So there's spitting out sausage on the other side. So then the banks are see that if they reverse redline, if they target, even if they target those who are the most financially unstable, for them, they just get a fee to sell that mortgage right away, and then it's broken up. And then it's out of their hands. It doesn't matter if the people can't pay it back, because it's not on them anymore. They sold that mortgage, right? But as with all things in the market, the capital is looking for something to invest in. An unregulated mortgage-backed derivatives is a great thing to invest in and then sell, to sell it rather quickly. It just kind of moves around.
Right.
And so that's where the systematic increase in risk came from, right? This reverse redlining. Okay, so that has to do with private capital. That's different than private property. And the third one is recognition, social recognition. And this is a much more philosophical concept. And this has to do with, by recognition, it means that it doesn't mean just I acknowledge you, I see you, I acknowledge you. There's Marcus. I see you, I acknowledge he was there. It means that I see the other, in the other, someone like myself. I see them as equal to me on some fundamental level. And so, to recognize someone is to see them, in this case, as someone who is free and worthy of dignity and respect. So when we say recognition in this context, we're talking about seeing in the other someone like myself. And why this is important, I think, in thinking about homelessness is because often, and I realized this more and more as I was doing this exhibition, is that more and more people were telling me, or I was hearing more and more, people who are saying this all the time, but I was hearing it more. That home is different than shelter. That home is not the same as shelter. So home and house or home and shelter are different things. And home has something to do with security and safety. Almost that theme keeps coming up. When anyone talks about what is it to be home, to feel at home, people say it's to feel safe and secure with those you're around. And there are folks who are able to create a community where they experience that but don't have shelter. And there are millions of people who have shelter but don't experience that sense of home, that sense of safety and security. So just think of all the millions that we incarcerate in the United States. Dangerous, unstable, lacking social recognition and equality and dignity and respect. And we have a talk about that tomorrow, Q&A, plug that. I forgot I was going to do that at the beginning. Sarah Tyson, my colleague, is going to be on a panel. Do prisons make us safer? And behind that idea is that no, they don't make us safer, in part because that kind of shelter is not a space of security and safety. It doesn't cultivate that condition. And so when thinking about social relations in our communities, I think the context or paradigm of social recognition is really important. And just to tie this back into what I said before when Jana asked her question or made her comment, this is not just about me acknowledging that someone is suffering. This is about me relating to that person. So I am in a sense implicated in the social relationship. We have to, in a sense, to achieve recognition, we have to mutually recognize each other as equals and worthy of dignity and respect. And that's no small order. And most of our institutions are set up to prevent that kind of social recognition from happening. In part because there are groups that don't want it to happen, because they get other benefits from preventing it. Oh, okay, I'm going to move so fast now since at least I got that out. So my approach here is to look at how all of these intersect in both the experience and reproduction of homelessness. Jeremy Waldron, we're going to skip over you. Okay, so I'll just go really quickly through this and end in like 5 minutes so we can have a discussion. So laws of public and private property are enforced by the state coercion in the form of police and prisons, with the rise of legislation criminalizing homelessness, legislation such as Denver's urban camping ban. Public spaces are less and less available for the satisfaction of the needs of those who lack private property. Anti-homeless technologies are also often employed in public spaces. We'll return to the private property in a second. So spikes, walls, section benches, sprinklers. So this is to prevent people from lying down, finding a place to sleep. Spikes on the ground when there's shelter or an overhang. This is a split picture of those spikes and then activists putting cement on them in the night to smooth it over. Again, more benches, individual tilted seats even, so you can lean against them, but not for too long.
Right.
Again, and these are all over the place. Tokyo, Salt Lake City. These pictures, by the way, are from a friend of mine, Robert Rosenberger, wrote a piece for The Atlantic about anti-homeless technology. That was very nice. This is an artist's response to these things. It's fantastic. There's a video about it too. So there's a little coin operator. So there are spikes, but if you put money in it, the spikes retract. And you can sit down for a bit. But it's kind, so then you have to keep putting money in. Beautiful. It's a German artist. It's from 2010. This is in Berlin. Okay. So basically, I won't read the quote, but basically, I really like this essay by Waldron. What he's saying is that people don't want folks to use their other people to use their private property to satisfy their needs. We're talking about basic needs. We're talking about sleeping, eating, urinating, defecating, sex. These are things that if you don't have private property in our society, you are forced to do those things on public property. But with the wave of legislation criminalizing that activity, then there's literally nowhere else to go. And so Waldron's argument, bringing out this contradiction, that people say, okay, I don't want them to use my property, but they also say, okay, I don't want them to use public property either. And that leaves folks with nowhere to go. Just quickly, I asked one of the photographers that was involved in the exhibition to take pictures of the dream of the Downtown Denver Partnership. So how they imagine 16th Street Mall downtown. So he gave this very nice,
It's beautiful.
what you want to cultivate. All their backs are turned to you. Okay, so the aggregate effect, as I mentioned, was if you deny, if private property is the only means to satisfy these needs, and public spaces are being more and more restricted from their exercise, you leave people nowhere to go. I already talked about securitization a bit. We talked about Q&A. Okay, I think what I'll do is I have other stuff on the urban rest stop as kind of alternatives, ways of having spaces for people to go, to use facilities, bathrooms, laundry, showers that are free, publicly accessible to everyone, and is one solution, immediate solution to this problem. And the question is why we don't have more of them. I'm just going to stop there. I want to say a lot more. We're going to stop there so we have a half hour to talk about it. So thank you very much.
I'd just like to say something real quick about our student assistant, Rachel. She had to scramble today with rooming constraints and food that had not arrived, and she made possible this great event, so I'd like to shout out to Rachel.
Thank you, Rachel.
I have a question. Can you talk more about the aesthetics thing? Like, because
I'm listening.
thinking from just an advocacy level, like it would seem pragmatic to show things that arise sympathy in another person. I also see that as dehumanizing, as when all of a sudden only the child gains our sympathy and not the guy who's been drunk for a year. You know, like somehow that person no longer has should be given the same freedom and respect. But I don't know. Can you expand on that?
Yeah. So I think that the idea is that when our strategy is to get people to care and take some kind of action out of pity or some kind of moral sympathy, we are depoliticizing and individuating the structures that produce homelessness. So we've reduced it both to an individual action as a solution, so I'm supposed to just give them money. And the problem is an individual problem in the sense of lack of personal responsibility, et cetera, savings. those savings? Why didn't you save? Now, it would be a different question if that strategy worked. Like, you could be pragmatic and say, well, you know, it misrepresents the real relationship. And it's not really presented, so it's not really presenting the social relations and structures that produce homelessness. But people are so responsive to kind of tugging the moral, you know, their heartstrings by showing the images of children that we're just going to keep doing it. But it's not working. And so, because it's not working, like, you know, many of you I know were there when the Denver Downtown Partnership wrote, pushed, and got passed the urban camping ban that literally criminalized homelessness in Colorado, or in Denver. And the shelters are full, so there's literally no place to go. And you criminalize that behavior. And there was no amount, I mean, I don't know, maybe Janet thinks that Tammy Dorr would respond to a homeless child. She wouldn't. And she doesn't, because she has vested interests. And she'll do things like the pajama sleepover, which is so offensive. This is so offensive, this pajama sleepover fundraiser. Sleep, I don't know, somehow related to sleep. That's the connection, I guess. That she doesn't, and she won't. And I think it's important for at least a good amount of people to connect why she doesn't. And by the way, this is interesting, because I know Janet is involved, many of the folks here are involved with actually demonstrating against Tammy Dorr, who heads the Downtown Denver Partnership. And this is a controversial tactic to go to her home and protest outside her home.
Nice.
Now, with the analysis that I get, well, I don't know, what do you think?
Flo thought it was.
What's that?
Flo thought it was controversial.
So I think it's an interesting, like in this perspective, you're going to someone's private residence and protesting. But their private residence, their wealth is predicated on the system that they're trying to reproduce at the expense of the security of so many. So if we don't have an analysis and aesthetics, you know, the concepts and tools to think about this, and an aesthetics that represent the conflict, the relation that's involved between those who are pushing these policies and those who are disadvantaged from them, then I think we fail, because we also fail to organize people to respond to it. Right? I mean, when you just see the sympathetic child, there is no social relation, there is no conflict of interest. Right? It's about, do you have it in your heart to give up a little bit of your money for this child? So is that?
Yeah. I'm just thinking as someone who wants policy and structures to change, but at the same time work for a place that needs funding now from private donors, you know. So like
Sure.
the balance of those things.
Yeah, and I totally understand that. Like, I can tell you, for example, let me give you a very concrete example. So this exhibition, not exactly, that happened last year. Every year, the Denver Downtown Partnership has given money to the signature exhibition, the large annual exhibition at Redline Denver. But they did what's called a capital strike for the exhibition that I curated. Not a single business gave a single dollar.
Whoa.
Precisely
Nice.
because it didn't fit
Right.
that model. And would take up the issue of the urban camping ban. Not even like really explicitly, but just it would be in the conversation. And so they withdrew all their funds. Now, Redline actually, we ended in the red because of this. So as an institution, they were harmed by my choices. So I understand that. And I had to fight with people who were trying to advertise that exhibition. They keep wanting to put the traditional imagery on all the brochures and everything to try to promote the exhibition in a way that completely contradicted what I was trying to do, which is to move away from that. So I understand that. But I don't know if those organizations that are doing fundraising in that way are I don't think they're the only organizations that are organizing homeless folks in the community to resist some of these policies. So, I'm not going to say that you should do that, but
Well, the Catholic Worker doesn't post sympathetic pictures all over the place, but just thinking critically about that, does it affect more change does it get more people involved when you point out that children are affected, like then all of a sudden, you can't blame a person's bad decisions, like you said. Like, so does that create more critical analysis where people stop and think, oh, this is systemic. This isn't. I can't blame this child. Like, which creates more. Critique, I don't know.
yeah, I think there's a lot of hands coming up, so I'm just going to say one quick thing to that, which is I think because it doesn't, I understand, like some people need to fundraise and they know that this will get some of the businesses or whatever gives them money. But we know that's not it's not a solution. It hasn't solved it. Things have not changed in the sense that there are still large numbers of homeless folks. And so, at some point, we have to step back and say, okay, maybe be pragmatic, but question whether or not the kinds of actions that we are, in a sense, broadcasting, representing as solutions, if we keep representing them in a way just because they get some money, but they're actually false representations of what needs to be done, are we, in a sense, at the same time, continually undermining our efforts? And so, it's just there's a lot of things. There's no one answer, but I think these are the questions I think we need to ask. So let me go. You at the far corner. You had your hand up, and then Gina, and then you had your hand up, and then I'll.
Just to kind of build off of that point, that in some cases it seems that when we focus on children and socially perceived innocence, which is pretty narrowly defined, we're reinforcing this idea of charity, and that the problem of homelessness can be addressed through charity, and it diminishes the idea of shelter as a human right, insofar as that's something that is obligatory to provide all individuals regardless of their social responsibilities or the decisions that they make in their lives. And so there is something disempowering to this idea that homelessness is something that can be ended by the private sector and by private charities without the intervention of the law or the government as a whole.
Right. And exactly. That's well said. And that brings up one point that I want to connect the first two elements of security. There is this idea, there's a very popular, widespread discourse that everyone who can get property can then do what they want and be free. And it's your lack of personal responsibility that doesn't allow you to get property to do these things. The second element of security, this private capital kind of offloading risk onto the public, is exactly the undermining of that idea. That even if you do everything right, you can have everything taken away by forces that have nothing to do with your personal decisions. And tens of millions of people have that happen to them.
Yeah.
And that's a problem. That completely undermines the argument that if you just do the right thing and have your own private property, then you can exercise that human right. It doesn't work like that. If we actually look at the social practices and concrete conditions, it's obviously not working.
I guess I'm interested in changing the viewpoints of the people of privilege. And I think it may be that they first get involved through pity. And I'm talking about setting up situations where their relationships do develop between homeless people and people of privilege. So the volunteers at the Women's Homeless Initiative who interact maybe a couple times a month with homeless women in terms of serving them dinner and talking to them, going outside with a smoking break. That usually, I mean, that has the potential of educating the people of privilege. So I guess I think it's possible that people of privilege can be educated, although nothing, so I'm hopeful, although I don't have any ideas about how any real solutions. But just that sometimes the feelings of pity can, that people can move beyond that.
Right.
But I think you bring up, the context that you bring that point up in, I think is really important, which is people sharing a meal, doing something, literally actively doing something with folks. Even if it's just hanging out and listening and talking to people. But that's actually a practice. That's actually something you're doing. And I think that that's different than pity. And so.
But it might, before that happens, the person might feel pity. But
Sure,
then they may change.
it might. And I'm thinking in terms of what should be our strategies for talking or thinking about these things and organizing around these issues. And so it could definitely be, and it's often the case, that people are first kind of introduced to the idea and become concerned from pity. But I think that doesn't go anywhere unless there's something like this practical activity. And that's, I think, that needs to be foregrounded. We need to think about actions that people can do and take, the way we can structure certain environments in order to promote that kind of interaction, because that's what challenges us as privileged, right? And so, yeah. So I would separate those two, but I take.
Yes, I'd like to give you a couple of different perspectives here. I don't think it's pity that motivated the urban camping ban so much as fear. Because I was in a small audience that heard the head of Denver Road Home. Yes, and say that the urban camping ban was not enacted toward homeless people. There was no intention of moving against them. But the city was scared to death of the Occupy Denver people who were camping at the Civic Center and other places. And there were legal issues involved in the march on the Occupy Denver that weren't. It was a red hot political issue. And that's why I don't think they have yet given a ticket to a homeless person on the camping ban. Therefore, it was fear.
I don't know folks that are tracking this already.
It was fear on the part of the city. I had a second observation, but I'll let it open up.
Yeah, I mean, just quickly, and then I'll let you all speak to that. I think the idea was proposed before Occupy emerged, and I think it was probably politically pragmatic to present it in the
That's right.
time of Occupy, being actually occupying space. And I definitely didn't mean to imply that the camping ban was out of pity. I think it's the opposite,
No.
vicious
No,
attack.
you didn't imply it.
No, you didn't.
Yeah,
No.
anger, greed, nastiness. Like there's
Nastiness.
nothing pity.
Oh,
And
man.
this is. Let me just use this to make the point about the difference between theory and practice, or what people say and what people are doing. The camping ban there aren't many tickets, but I'll let other folks comment on that. The point is just to clear people out, to have the authority to coerce people out of a space that can be claimed by private property, by private businesses. And this is that battle between the private and public spaces. And so I think that's why the camping ban was put in power as a tool to, in a sense, tap the coercive powers of the state through the police to, in a sense, facilitate a certain kind of norm in that public space to help the business. But do you want to speak to that?
Yeah. So the urban camping ban was drafted by the Downtown River Partnership, which in effect acts as a very similar instrument of business improvement district, which which is a sort of organization of businesses in different regions. And this is something that occurs all throughout the United States. It's not very limited to Colorado. So initially, the urban camping ban, the unauthorized camping ordinance, was drafted back in the 90s with the partnership between the city of Austin and Denver. And they deliberated a lot and came up with ground rules and how to implement it. And it just sort of hit the sidelines. And then they put in the sit-lie law and other smaller things before they got to the unauthorized camping ordinance. So this is something that's been passed around nationally as a local law that's enforced in business improvement districts, and it's very common actually. And so the difference with the one here in Denver is they really never had enough stimulus from the service provider world to be able to push it onto the city council and to have good backing with it. So when Occupy Denver came around, there was suddenly stimulus from the business developers of the downtown area to get this law into effect so that they can, one, push all the homeless out of the downtown area, and two, get rid of all the protesters that are speaking out against their businesses. So it was a very strategic move and very tactically pushed through.
Right.
And that is sort of how it happened. But to say it's not against the homeless would be very, is a big statement. So when there's the fact that there's no arrests on it, it's the fact that the moment they arrest somebody, it becomes challenged because it's very unconstitutional. It's a highly unconstitutional law. So
They'll
what they
never
use
get
as
a
a homeless
ticket.
stop and frisk. They'll use it to approach a homeless individual, shake them down, go through their pockets,
Steal their shit.
check them for warrants, and
Throw
check
them
for
in
drugs
jail.
and numerous of other things, and arrest them on any other law except for the camping ordinance. But contact with the camping ordinance is made routinely all the time, throughout the day and night. And it's just it's a homeless stop and frisk essentially.
Yeah.
That's right, nice job.
Teresa and John, did you want to comment about the rest or?
Well, Therese can probably comment about the arrest, but I just want to point out that from my viewpoint, being a formerly homeless veteran, part of the reason that any of these fill in the blank wanted a camping ban, it's pure selfishness. It's, oh, we have homeless people that might negatively affect my business. I'm not going to be making my $2 billion a month. So let's get rid of them. Let's not be humane. Let's not act like they're human. Let's fix my selfish problem.
I'll just say real quick, if anybody is interested in more of the details of what is happening in terms of police contact specifically related to the urban camping ban, the organization that a bunch of us are part of, Denver Homeless Out Loud, put out a report. We surveyed over 500 people who are homeless about this. So there's a complex relationship, but Benjamin really summed it up. It's mostly move along, stop and frisk, and stealing stuff, and all sorts of other effects without getting an actual urban camping ban ticket. And actually often ticketing people for other laws which aren't the urban camping ban, which those tickets are then dismissed because they're avoiding giving actual urban camping ban tickets.
I just want to say that I in no way was trying to express any approval for any of this.
No, I understand
Saying
that. I think-
Public motives and private motives are not always the same.
Sure. Let me go Billy and then Sarah and then Nancy.
I feel really bad to change the subject a little bit from your direction, but I have to leave soon. I'm sorry.
There.
But I think one factor, and I'm very much an activist in all of these issues, as we know.
Yeah.
But I think one factor that's very important is city government and the role of city council. 9 votes for this, 4 against it,
Right.
and the role of the mayor in supporting it.
Right.
And having worked for city governments for many years,
Yeah.
and for Mayor Pena and other good mayors around the country, when homelessness was not a major issue,
Right.
so we didn't have to deal with it. But I think it's very important to make this an issue within city government, because they have all kinds of people telling them about what the city needs, and the city needs all these things. but making homelessness a critical issue and taking responsibility for it in some cities has resulted in some good stuff. And Mayor Hancock has not chosen to do that here. And I think that it's very important to put pressure and elect people to city government who will take this seriously and allocate more resources.
Thank you, Billy. Thank you, Billy. Sarah?
Thanks so much for the talk, Chad. I was wondering if you'd say a little bit more about social recognition, because I have a sense, but I'm always a little worried when you say, I see something like me in you, right? And I'm thinking of like somebody like Iris Young here, where what if I see something, I see you and I think you're nothing like me, and I still think you deserve shelter, right? Building coalitions, not on recognition, but on something else, or do you mean recognition that could, I don't know, allow for a lot of difference between us, but I still think you deserve shelter, and there's something about I'm recognizing in you that's enough like me, even though we're so different on in all of these ways. So would you say more, I'm worried about social recognition, will you say more about what you're thinking about when you say social recognition?
Yeah, I'll say a little bit more, just because we're almost out of time. Yes, definitely. I mean, the reason, and I didn't get to explain it much because of the late start and whatnot, but when I talk about recognizing something like us in the other, I'm talking about the most fundamental aspect of what it is to be a human being. And so someone can be, different race, different gender, different ability, different age, all these things have different interests. That is not what I'm talking. But the really important dynamic of social recognition is that it's mutual. It's not just that I pity the other person, I recognize them as a suffering individual and want to somehow relieve them. Literally, my identity as a person is constituted by my relationship to that other person. And this is why I talked about the deformation of our sense of self, is that if I see the other as less than myself, I am doing the same thing to myself. I'm in a sense not fully developing myself. I'm seeing the other as less than, and thus creating a false, an unrealistic image of myself. And so this is really problematic and reproduces. And so I think a lot of the struggles we've seen in the 20th century in particular have been struggles around social recognition, race, gender, ability, even class. And so Young is fantastic. I love Young, but I do think that there is, you could call it something else if you want, but somehow that we come to understand reflectively that our identity is constituted by our relationship to the other. They're not radically different than us. They actually participate in the constitution of who we are. And thus it really matters how we treat them and how they see us. Right? That's an unsatisfactory answer. But I just wanted to get Nancy and then...
I was trying to quietly leave. Yeah, I'm okay. Enjoy. I was going to clap a little bit. Okay. Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah,
Good
sure.
day.
Got it.
Oh, that's okay.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, take care.
Should I just tell it's been like 6 weeks?
The two have really got hurt. Nancy, you're gonna have the last word.
Oh, well, there's a point I want to make, and I hope I can. So I'd like to ask, how can the privilege be approached? Do to change their views or to change their behavior is like, to me, really the wrong question. Like how getting to know, yeah, it's good, you know, the more people get to know people who are different, maybe they change their behavior. But I don't see that any real important change has ever come about because privilege have decided they would give up their privilege. So I guess what I'm wondering, and what you and others would share about this, is what do you see? I mean, because to me, Billy got at it, you know, somewhat by saying we need to impress on local government. But what are the barriers to people experiencing homelessness and poverty? What do you see as the barriers to organizing and uniting and exerting power, which is the only way anything ever changes? And what might encourage that to happen? And by the way, we have our Denver Homeless Out Loud news magazine, the voice of people experiencing homelessness. Get loud, please take a copy.
Yes.
Anyway, what does everybody see as barriers and encouragement or facilitation of people organizing?
I'm just gonna say a 30-second response, and then that's a good discussion point for us to end on and eat some food if you can stick around and talk about that. I think when I brought up those 3 dimensions of security, I think the first 2 are really need to be challenged. So this is not just like a local, I mean, we can talk about local organizing for local government, but I think the private property regimes that we have and the function of the police and public spaces and the deregulation of finance capital and even the system as a whole, these are all implicated. These are all related. And so one of the things I wanted to say is that the experience of homelessness is, in a sense, this intersection of these forces that are way beyond their community. Now that makes it seem like a big project, huge project, and it is a huge project, but it's a more accurate analysis of what's happening. I absolutely agree with you that folks of privilege who are invested in the status quo, their identities, their wealth, their status, their social position are all, they're invested in the status quo, will not give up these things. Even morally, they do not respond to these things. And so it must be fought for. And so I think it's not just about having dinner with folks at your, homeless folks at your house or something. I think it's about organizing and demanding, resisting these forces. Now, why I think the critique that I gave of this kind of moral sympathy is important is because that takes us so far away from that organizing forces to put pressure to really radically transform the liberties of ours. And so we keep reproducing this cycle without building up the resources to actually have social power to resist. How we get people to actually do that, there are all different forms. Denver Homeless Out Loud is a fantastic organization that's organizing people and doing it, right? And Jen, do you want to say what you're involved in, and then we'll close out?
Yeah. I protested in the urban camping ban and the Downtown Denver Partnership every Friday night, feeding the homeless at 5:30 at Tattercover on 16th and Whitecube. I bet 150 people. I could sure use some help. And then Tammy Dorr, who is the CEO of the Downtown Denver Partnership, I protest her house every Sunday from 3 to 5.
Good for you.
Yeah. If you pass stupid little laws like that, expect us at your house, huh? Expect us there. That's what I say.
Rock on.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Chad.
What time do you go?
There's lots of copies of Get Loud.
Hi, I'm Sarah. Nice to meet you.